Welcome to another captivating story here on The Director. Today, we bring you The Silent Truth, a tale that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about justice and innocence. Imagine a 12-year-old boy sentenced to life in prison for the murder of a powerful man's infant daughter, his silence sealing his fate. But what if that silence wasn't guilt, but fear? And what if the real killer was someone far closer to the victim than anyone could have imagined? Stay with us, because the truth behind this case will shock you to your core. The courtroom was a sea of whispers and shifting gazes as the judge prepared to announce his verdict. At the center of it all sat Miguel, a frail 12-year-old boy whose fate had captured the entire city's attention. Accused of murdering the infant daughter of William Hartman, the wealthiest and most influential man in the region, Miguel faced a sentence of life imprisonment. The sheer weight of those words felt like a hammer blow to everyone present. Yet, in the face of such a devastating accusation, Miguel's reaction, or lack thereof, stirred something unsettling in the hearts of those watching. Miguel sat motionless, his small hands clenched tightly on his lap, his eyes locked on the cold, polished floor. His silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow the noise and chaos around him. The judge, an experienced man who had presided over countless cases, couldn't ignore the boy's demeanor. Something about Miguel felt wrong, and not in the way the prosecution claimed. He didn't carry the arrogance or defiance of a killer, nor the bitterness of a cornered liar. What the judge saw was far more troubling. A broken child, consumed by fear and despair. But fear of what? That was the question he couldn't shake. The case itself had been built on shaky grounds, though no one dared say it aloud. The prosecution's narrative was simple. Miguel, a local delivery boy, had been found near the scene of the crime with blood on his hands. The victim, a 6-month-old baby, had died from suffocation, her lifeless body discovered in a plush nursery at the Hartman estate. With no family or powerful allies to defend him, Miguel had become the perfect scapegoat for William Hartman, whose influence extended to the police and media. Justice meant swift and unyielding punishment for the accused, regardless of the truth. As the evidence was presented over the past weeks, it became clear that much of it relied on circumstantial details. The blood on Miguel's hands was later revealed to be his own, caused by a cut he sustained during a fall outside the estate. The timeline of events, provided by a single security guard on Hartman's payroll, conveniently placed Miguel at the scene moments before the crime was discovered. Yet Miguel's silence throughout the trial made it impossible to refute the claims. His refusal or inability to speak was interpreted as guilt, fueling public outrage in Hartman's relentless pursuit of a conviction. What the courtroom didn't know, however, was that Miguel's silence wasn't a choice. It was a shield, a desperate attempt to protect himself from something far more terrifying than the judgment of the court. Only one person seemed to sense this, Judge Solomon Hayes. Despite his initial inclination to deliver a harsh sentence, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something critical had been overlooked. Miguel's behavior, his avoidance of eye contact, his flinches whenever certain names were mentioned, all these details painted a picture of trauma, not malice. The turning point came as the judge reviewed the case files one last time. Among the documents was a transcript of Miguel's arrest. The boy had been found trembling and incoherent, unable to respond to basic questions. The arresting officer noted his repeated glances toward a shadowed corner of the Hartman estate, a detail dismissed as irrelevant but now gnawing at Hayes' mind. Could it be that Miguel wasn't just afraid of the accusation? Could he be protecting someone? The judge felt a growing sense of unease. When the moment arrived to deliver the verdict, the judge hesitated. The courtroom was silent, the audience holding their breath in anticipation. Hayes looked down at Miguel, who seemed impossibly small in the defendant's chair. He had seen criminals of all kinds, hardened, remorseless, manipulative, but Miguel was none of those things. His silence, his trembling frame, his inability to meet anyone's gaze. These were signs of a child carrying an unimaginable burden. "I need more time," the judge finally announced, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Gasps erupted from the crowd as murmurs of confusion spread like wildfire. William Hartman, seated in the front row with his legal team, clenched his jaw in frustration. This court cannot in good conscience render a final judgment without further investigation, Hayes continued, his tone resolute. There are gaps in this case that demand answers. Miguel's eyes flickered upward for the briefest moment, meeting the judges. In that fleeting second, Hayes saw something he hadn't before: hope. It was faint, buried beneath layers of fear, but it was there. For the first time, Miguel seemed to realize that someone was willing to look deeper, to see him as more than just an accused murderer. The gavel struck, and the courtroom descended into chaos. Reporters scrambled to relay the unexpected delay, while Hartman's lawyers huddled in heated whispers. As Miguel was escorted back to his holding cell, Judge Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he had just taken the first step toward unraveling a truth far darker than anyone could imagine. The silence that had once seemed damning now felt like a key to a story that had yet to be told. The events following the unexpected postponement of Miguel's sentencing were nothing short of chaotic. Judge Hayes' decision to delay the verdict had sparked a firestorm of controversy, with public opinion sharply divided. On one side, supporters of William Hartman and his pursuit of justice decried the move as an affront to the grieving family. On the other, murmurs of doubt began to surface, whispered among those who had been unsettled by Miguel's fragile demeanor. It was as if the judge's hesitation had cracked open a door no one had dared approach, exposing questions that had been deliberately ignored. Miguel's silence continued to speak volumes, even as he was escorted back to the juvenile detention facility where he awaited further proceedings. The boy had become an unwilling symbol, caught between the overwhelming power of Hartman's influence and the emerging narrative that his trial had been far from fair. Yet, for Miguel, the world outside the courtroom meant little. In the solitude of his cell, he sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, his trembling hands clutching a small, worn notebook. Inside were sketches he had drawn, images that told a story far darker than any witness testimony had revealed. It was during these long hours of isolation that Dr. Evelyn Roas, a forensic psychologist appointed by the court, made her first visit. Hayes, increasingly convinced that Miguel's behavior held the key to understanding the case, had personally requested Roas's involvement. Known for her expertise in childhood trauma and selective mutism, she was tasked with uncovering the truth locked inside Miguel's mind. The boy, however, barely acknowledged her presence when she entered the room, his eyes fixed on the floor as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. Dr. Roas began with gentle observations, noting Miguel's reluctance to speak but also his heightened sensitivity to certain triggers. Each time she mentioned Hartman's estate or specific individuals connected to the case, Miguel's body visibly tensed. He recoiled slightly whenever the name Uncle Roberto was spoken, a detail that immediately set off alarm bells in Rosa's mind. The boy's reactions weren't those of guilt but of fear, the kind of deep-seated terror that comes from long-term exposure to abuse or manipulation. She jotted down her observations meticulously, determined to piece together the fragments of Miguel's silent testimony. It wasn't until Roas noticed the notebook that the session took a critical turn. With permission from the facility staff, she gently asked Miguel if she could see it. At first, he hesitated, clutching the notebook as if it were a lifeline, but after a long moment of silence, he slid it across the table, his hand shaking as he let it go. Inside were dozens of drawings, each one more unsettling than the last. Dark, jagged lines depicted shadowy figures looming over smaller, vulnerable forms. One image showed a man towering over a crib, his hand extended as if to snuff out the life within. Another portrayed a pair of frightened eyes watching from a cracked door. Roas's breath caught as she flipped through the pages, each drawing pulling her deeper into Miguel's world. These were not the creations of a guilty mind, but of a terrified witness, a child who had seen horrors no one should ever endure. She immediately flagged the notebook as critical evidence, arranging for copies to be sent to Judge Hayes and the investigative team. Her initial report suggested that Miguel's silence was not an admission of guilt, but a shield against something or someone far more dangerous. Meanwhile, the Hartman estate was in turmoil. William Hartman, furious over the delay, intensified his efforts to control the narrative. His public relations team flooded the media with stories portraying Miguel as a delinquent, emphasizing his lack of family ties and painting him as a threat to society. Behind closed doors, however, cracks began to show. Members of Hartman's staff whispered about oddities in the timeline of events, inconsistencies that had been swept under the rug during the initial investigation. One security guard, emboldened by the growing scrutiny, hinted at discrepancies in his testimony, though he stopped short of coming forward officially. Judge Hayes, poring over Rosa's preliminary findings late one evening, found himself more convinced than ever that the case was far from resolved. He ordered a deeper investigation into Miguel's background and the circumstances surrounding the crime. This included interviews with neighbors, school staff, and anyone who might shed light on the boy's life before the tragedy. What emerged was a portrait of a child who had been largely invisible, a quiet, hard-working boy who avoided trouble and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Yet, there was one recurring detail that stood out. Miguel's frequent deliveries to the Hartman estate, often at odd hours and always in the presence of Roberto, Hartman's brother-in-law. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Roberto was more than just a minor figure in the family's inner circle. Known for his temper and questionable dealings, he had been a looming presence in Miguel's life for months before the crime. Witnesses recalled seeing Roberto yelling at the boy on multiple occasions, though none could say why. These revelations painted a new and disturbing picture, one that suggested Miguel had been coerced into silence, possibly to protect himself or someone he cared about. The chapter closed with a single, chilling discovery. A neighbor who lived near the estate came forward with an anonymous tip, claiming to have heard muffled cries and shouting on the night of the crime. According to them, the voices included not just Miguel's, but a deeper, more menacing tone, one that matched Roberto's. The tip was enough to prompt Hayes to escalate the case, ordering a full reinvestigation of the crime scene and questioning everyone involved. For Miguel, locked away in his cell, the world outside was shifting. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable began to show cracks, as the truth he couldn't speak fought to break free. The reinvestigation into the Hartman case sent shockwaves through the city. Judge Hayes' determination to uncover the truth had opened a floodgate of scrutiny, forcing even the staunchest supporters of William Hartman to confront unsettling new details. Hartman, a man known for his iron grip on his public image, found himself on the defensive. Reporters began probing his family's secrets, while whispers of impropriety surrounding Roberto, his brother-in-law, grew louder. Yet amidst the growing tension, Miguel remained the most enigmatic piece of the puzzle, silent, fragile, and somehow holding the key to unraveling the tragedy. Dr. Evelyn Rosa's findings proved invaluable as investigators revisited the Hartman estate. Her analysis of Miguel's drawings, combined with her assessment of his behavior, pointed to the nursery as the crime's epicenter, but not in the way initially assumed. Roas theorized that Miguel had witnessed the crime rather than committed it. The images he had drawn, a man's shadow looming over a crib, terrified eyes peering through a crack in a door, were consistent with the fragmented recollections of a traumatized witness. She emphasized to Hayes that Miguel's silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. The investigative team returned to the estate with fresh eyes, combing the nursery and surrounding areas for overlooked clues. Among their discoveries was a small, blood-stained blanket tucked behind a dresser, its presence previously dismissed as unrelated. Forensic analysis revealed that the blood belonged to the infant victim, but the pattern suggested it had been deliberately placed out of sight, a chilling detail that raised questions about the crime scene staging. Further investigation into Roberto's role in the household revealed a troubling history of unchecked aggression and control, often directed at those less powerful than him. Meanwhile, tensions within the Hartman family reached a boiling point. William Hartman's wife, Grace, had remained largely in the background during the initial trial, her demeanor one of quiet grief. However, as questions surrounding Roberto's involvement grew, Grace's silence began to crack. Under pressure from investigators, she admitted to having concerns about her brother's behavior for years. She spoke of his temper, his history of intimidating staff, and his unusual closeness to the nursery on the night of the crime. Grace's revelations, though hesitant and fragmented, added another layer to the growing case against Roberto. Miguel's own world remained a lonely one. Confined to the juvenile detention facility, he spent his days in silence, drawing or staring out the narrow window of his cell. But the arrival of a visitor marked a turning point. Judge Hayes, determined to connect with the boy on a personal level, requested a one-on-one meeting. It was an unconventional move, but Hayes believed that Miguel needed to see a face willing to listen without judgment. Sitting across from Miguel in a small, sterile room, Hayes spoke with a calm, measured tone. He didn't ask questions or demand answers. Instead, he told stories of children he had once known, of cases where the truth had taken years to surface but had ultimately prevailed. Miguel's gaze remained fixed on the floor, but Hayes noticed subtle shifts in his posture. The boy's hands unclenched slightly, and for the first time he glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Hayes's. It was a fleeting moment, but Hayes saw something he hadn't before, an ember of trust. Outside the detention center, public opinion began to shift. The media, initially dominated by Hartman's narrative, started highlighting inconsistencies in the case. Articles questioned why Miguel, a boy with no history of violence, would suddenly commit such a heinous act. Others focused on Roberto, scrutinizing his business dealings and personal conduct. The pressure mounted as new witnesses came forward, including former employees of the Hartman estate, who described Roberto as volatile and manipulative. One testimony stood out among the rest. A housekeeper who had worked for the Hartmans for over a decade recounted an argument she overheard between Roberto and Grace weeks before the crime. According to her, Roberto had demanded access to Hartman's accounts, threatening to expose family secrets if denied. The housekeeper claimed that Roberto had always been a source of tension within the family, often leveraging his knowledge of their private lives to maintain control. Her statement painted a picture of a man willing to go to extreme lengths to protect his position. The chapter reached its climax when investigators uncovered a critical piece of evidence: surveillance footage from a neighboring property. The grainy video showed Roberto entering the Hartman estate late at night, carrying what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in a blanket. Minutes later, the same camera captured Miguel running out of the estate, clutching his injured hand. The footage didn't prove Miguel's innocence outright, but it raised serious doubts about Roberto's alibi and suggested he had been present during the time of the crime. As the walls closed in on Roberto, his demeanor shifted. Once smug and dismissive, he grew increasingly erratic, refusing to cooperate with investigators and lashing out at reporters. Hartman, too, began to falter under the mounting pressure. His once unshakable confidence gave way to visible frustration as his attempts to control the narrative failed. For Miguel, the cracks in the Hartman family's facade brought a glimmer of hope. Though still locked away, he could sense that the tide was beginning to turn. The chapter ended with a powerful image. Miguel, seated alone in his cell, sketching a figure standing in the shadows of a doorway. This time, the figure was different. It wasn't looming or threatening. It was watching. Silent, yes, but with a presence that spoke volumes. It was the image of a boy who had seen too much and carried the weight of truth too heavy for words. And for the first time, that truth was beginning to find its voice. The air around the Hartman estate had grown thick with unease as the investigation pushed deeper into its carefully constructed walls. What had once been a symbol of wealth and power now seemed tainted, a facade crumbling under the weight of dark secrets. Roberto's erratic behavior and the damning surveillance footage had shifted the narrative, but it was still only the beginning. Judge Hayes, driven by the boy's silent plea for justice, ordered the reopening of all evidence related to the case, a move that sent ripples of fear and anger through those desperate to keep the truth buried. Inside the juvenile detention facility, Miguel's world remained one of isolation, though it began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Dr. Evelyn Rose's visits had become a source of cautious stability for him. Unlike the harsh interrogations he'd endured, her presence brought no demands or accusations. Instead, she offered small glimpses of kindness, guiding him to express his pain through his drawings. With each session, Miguel's sketches became more detailed, more revealing. One, in particular, caught Rose's attention, a haunting depiction of a crib surrounded by shadowy figures, with a small figure hiding under a table nearby. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a memory. Rose brought the sketch to Judge Hayes, explaining its significance. "He saw it," she said firmly, sliding the paper across his desk. "Miguel was there when it happened, but not as the perpetrator. This isn't the mind of a killer. It's the mind of a witness, a terrified child trying to protect himself." Hayes studied the drawing for a long moment, the jagged lines and smudged shapes telling a story that words could not. It was becoming increasingly clear that Miguel had been caught in a web far larger than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, the reinvestigation uncovered new cracks in Roberto's alibi. A forensic team discovered traces of fabric fibers in the nursery that matched the jacket Roberto was known to wear, further implicating him in the crime scene. But it was a witness statement from a delivery driver that delivered the most significant blow. The driver recalled seeing Roberto arguing with Miguel outside the estate on the night of the murder. Though the boy was silent, his body language, arms raised defensively, his head bowed, spoke volumes. "He looked scared," the driver had said, "like he wanted to run, but didn't know where to go." Back at the Hartman estate, Grace Hartman was no longer a quiet bystander. The pressure of the investigation, combined with her growing guilt, finally pushed her to confront the truth she had long avoided. Late one evening, she broke her silence, sitting down with investigators to reveal a side of Roberto few had seen. According to Grace, Roberto had always been manipulative, using his position within the family to shield himself from consequences. She admitted she had been aware of his volatile temper and his cruel streak toward those he deemed inferior, but she had never imagined it could escalate to murder. Her testimony was a devastating blow to Roberto's crumbling defense. William Hartman, however, refused to acknowledge the shifting tide. To him, the world was divided into those who serve his interests and those who oppose them. He doubled down on his campaign to portray Miguel as a dangerous criminal, calling press conferences to reiterate his narrative. But the public's faith in his story had begun to waver. The once sympathetic image of a grieving father was overshadowed by his refusal to confront the mounting evidence against Roberto. Whispers of a cover-up spread through the city, with even some of Hartman's allies beginning to distance themselves. For Miguel, the cracks in the Hartman family's armor brought a fragile sense of hope. He still didn't speak, but his demeanor began to shift during his sessions with Dr. Rose. The drawings became less frantic, their lines more deliberate, as if he were beginning to reclaim control of his narrative. In one session, he handed Rose a new sketch, his hands trembling slightly as he passed it across the table. The image showed a small boy standing in the shadows, watching as a larger figure leaned over a crib. This time, the boy in the drawing was not hiding. He was observing. As the investigation neared its boiling point, an unexpected figure entered the fray. Miguel's uncle, a distant relative named Mateo, arrived after being contacted by Judge Hayes. A quiet man with a kind face, Mateo had been unaware of the trial until recently. He was horrified to learn of Miguel's situation and immediately offered to support the boy. Mateo's presence brought a sense of stability to Miguel's otherwise chaotic life, and for the first time, the boy seemed to trust someone outside his narrow circle of survival. Mateo's involvement also brought new revelations. He provided letters Miguel's mother had written before her death, detailing her struggles to protect her son from external threats. Though the letters didn't specify names, she feared something, Mateo explained to Hayes. She never told me what, but she made it clear that Miguel was in danger, even before all of this happened. These letters painted a chilling picture of a family targeted by forces far beyond their control, further emphasizing Miguel's role as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The chapter reached its crescendo during a court hearing called to review the newly uncovered evidence. Judge Hayes sat at the bench, his gaze steady as the prosecution and defense clashed over the implications of the findings. Miguel was present, but as an observer rather than a defendant. His silence, once seen as damning, now stood as a powerful testament to the gravity of the case. When the surveillance footage was presented, showing Roberto entering the estate and Miguel fleeing with his injured hand, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Hayes raised his gavel, restoring order, but the impact was clear. The truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was within reach. The chapter ended with Miguel back in his cell, staring at the night sky through the small, barred window. The hope that had flickered faintly in his eyes was now a steady ember. He didn't know when the truth would fully emerge, but he knew it was no longer buried. Somewhere out there, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and for the first time, he believed they would form a picture that told his story. Not the one forced upon him, but the one he had lived. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a stage where secrets long buried began to surface. The re-examination of Miguel's case had set in motion a series of revelations, each one more damning than the last. Roberto, once seen as an untouchable figure within the Hartman family, now stood at the center of suspicion. His carefully curated image was unraveling, exposing a man capable of manipulation and violence. For Judge Hayes, this transformation wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about protecting a boy whose innocence was becoming harder to deny. Miguel's presence in the courtroom was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. He sat silently, his small frame almost swallowed by the chair meant for adults. The once vilifying stares from the public had softened, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Dr. Evelyn Rose, seated beside him as his advocate, watched carefully for signs of distress. Miguel still hadn't spoken, but his drawings continued to serve as his voice. The latest sketch, handed to Rose just days before, depicted a handprint smeared on a wall. A chilling detail investigators later confirmed matched the crime scene. Miguel's silence was no longer a mystery. It was evidence. As the investigation progressed, the narrative around Roberto grew darker. Interviews with former employees of the Hartman estate revealed years of unchecked dominance. One maid recounted how Roberto had a habit of lurking around the nursery late at night, offering unsolicited advice about how to care for the baby. Another staff member described an incident where Roberto had angrily lashed out at Miguel, accusing him of theft when a missing watch was later found in his own room. These stories painted a picture of a man who thrived on control, using intimidation to keep those around him in line. Meanwhile, Grace Hartman's quiet rebellion against her brother gained momentum. After weeks of internal struggle, she provided investigators with a journal she had kept over the years. Its pages were filled with entries documenting her suspicions about Roberto's behavior, including his increasing obsession with the Hartman fortune. One entry, dated just weeks before the crime, described a heated argument in which Roberto had threatened to take matters into his own hands if William didn't grant him greater access to the family's assets. The journal became a critical piece of evidence, linking Roberto's motives to the tragic death of the infant. Judge Hayes, reviewing the mounting evidence, began to see a clear pattern. Roberto's manipulative tactics had extended beyond the Hartman estate and into the courtroom itself. Hayes ordered an audit of the original investigation, uncovering troubling connections between Roberto and several key players, including a lead detective who had ignored critical inconsistencies in Miguel's case. The detective, now under scrutiny, admitted to being pressured to focus solely on Miguel, ensuring a swift resolution that would satisfy the Hartman family's public image. For Miguel, the tide was finally turning. Though he remained physically confined, the cracks in Roberto's defense offered him a sense of liberation. Mateo, his uncle, became a regular presence, bringing small tokens of comfort, a favorite snack, a worn book from Miguel's childhood, and, most importantly, his unwavering support. Mateo's efforts to connect with Miguel went beyond material gestures. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the boy's trust in family, something that had been shattered long before the crime. The breakthrough came during a tense court session when new evidence was presented. A voicemail left on Grace's phone by Roberto on the night of the crime. In the recording, Roberto's voice was frantic, filled with anger and desperation. "You'll regret this, Grace," he hissed, his words barely audible over the sound of a baby crying in the background. The voicemail's timestamp placed him at the scene during the critical window of the crime, directly contradicting his alibi. When the audio played in court, the room fell into a stunned silence. Even William Hartman, seated stoically in the front row, couldn't hide his discomfort. The pressure on Roberto reached a boiling point. Once defiant, he now avoided eye contact and refused to answer direct questions. His legal team scrambled to mitigate the damage, but the evidence was overwhelming. Roberto's influence, once wielded with precision, now crumbled under the weight of his lies. William, faced with the undeniable truth, began to withdraw from the public eye. For the first time, the patriarch of the Hartman family appeared powerless, a man undone by the very secrets he had sought to protect. Amid these developments, Miguel's silence remained his strongest weapon. Though he hadn't spoken a word, his presence alone had shifted the balance of the case. Judge Hayes, reflecting on the boy's resilience, saw in him a quiet strength that defied his age. Hayes decided it was time to bring Miguel's voice into the courtroom, not through words, but through the stories told by his drawings and the testimony of those who had come to understand his truth. The chapter concluded with a powerful moment. During a private session with Dr. Roas, Miguel handed her a final sketch. It was different from the others, simpler, yet profoundly symbolic. It depicted two figures, a small boy standing in the light and a larger figure engulfed in shadows, reaching toward him. For Roas, the message was clear. Miguel no longer saw himself as hidden or powerless. He was ready for the truth to come fully into the light. The Hartman family's empire, once unshakable, was collapsing under the weight of its secrets. With every new revelation, the pristine image of power and prestige gave way to a darker reality, one riddled with manipulation and betrayal. The court proceedings had turned into a public spectacle, with media outlets broadcasting every twist to an audience that had become invested in uncovering the truth. Miguel, the silent boy at the center of it all, remained a mystery, but his silence now felt like a storm waiting to break. In the courtroom, tension was palpable as the prosecution prepared to cross-examine Grace Hartman. Her testimony had already shaken the case, and now she was ready to take her stand against Roberto directly. Grace appeared composed but resolute, her voice steady as she recounted years of intimidation and coercion at the hands of her brother. She spoke of his growing resentment toward William's success and his obsession with controlling the family's wealth. He believed the family owed him, she stated firmly, her words cutting through the courtroom's silence like a blade. When asked about the night of the crime, Grace hesitated briefly before revealing a detail that had haunted her since that night. She had heard a crash in the nursery and rushed to investigate, but Roberto intercepted her in the hallway, blocking her path. "He told me to stay out of it," she said, her voice trembling. "He said he had everything under control." The prosecution pressed her for more details, but her emotions overwhelmed her. Grace's testimony was raw, a mix of guilt and sorrow, but it was clear that her brother had manipulated her into silence for far too long. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered additional evidence linking Roberto to the crime. A forensic team revisited the nursery, armed with advanced tools that had not been available during the initial investigation. Their efforts yielded a crucial discovery: fingerprints on the crib that matched Roberto's. The placement of the prints indicated he had been leaning over the baby, contradicting his earlier statements that he had never entered the room. This physical evidence, combined with Grace's testimony and the damning voicemail, left little doubt about his involvement. As the noose tightened around Roberto, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. In private meetings with his legal team, he lashed out, blaming everyone but himself for his predicament. Publicly, he maintained his innocence, but cracks in his facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Reporters captured images of him leaving the courthouse with a haunted expression, his once confident stride reduced to a hesitant shuffle. Roberto was a man cornered, and everyone could see it. For Miguel, the unraveling of Roberto's lies marked a turning point. Though still confined to the juvenile detention facility, he began to sense that justice was finally within reach. Mateo, his uncle, played a crucial role in keeping his spirits up, visiting him daily and sharing updates about the case. During one such visit, Mateo brought a small gift, a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils. Miguel accepted them with a faint smile, the first visible sign of hope he had shown since his arrest. With his new tools, Miguel's drawings took on a brighter tone, gone were the jagged lines and dark shadows that had characterized his earlier sketches. Instead, he began to create images of open landscapes with figures standing under clear skies. Dr. Evelyn Rose interpreted this change as a sign of healing, proof that Miguel was beginning to see a future beyond the trauma that had consumed him. His drawings, once filled with fear, now carried a quiet strength, a reflection of his resilience. The courtroom drama reached its peak when Roberto was finally called to the stand. His testimony was a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, but his words only deepened the suspicions against him. Under intense questioning, his story unraveled further, revealing inconsistencies that painted him as both manipulative and untrustworthy. The defense attempted to redirect attention to Miguel, suggesting that the boy's silence was a sign of guilt. But the strategy backfired spectacularly when Dr. Rose presented Miguel's final drawing to the court. The sketch was displayed on a large screen, its simplicity belying its profound impact. It depicted a small child standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching as a shadowy figure reached into a crib. The room fell silent as Dr. Rose explained the significance of the image. "This is not a confession," she said firmly. "This is the memory of a child who witnessed a terrible act and has been silenced by fear ever since." Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. Miguel's drawings had always spoken louder than words, but this one carried a weight that no one could ignore. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a visual testimony that cut through the noise and laid bare the truth. Roberto's demeanor shifted visibly as the image was displayed. For the first time, he looked truly cornered, his bravado replaced by a flicker of panic. The court could see it. The guilt he had tried so desperately to conceal was now written all over his face. As the hearing adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Reporters rushed to file their stories, and spectators buzzed with speculation about what would come next. Miguel was escorted back to his cell, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. The truth he had carried alone for so long was finally coming to light. He didn't need to say a word. His silence had spoken for him. The chapter closed with an image of Miguel sitting on the edge of his bed, sketch pad in hand. This time, he wasn't drawing shadows or fear. He was drawing a sunrise, its light breaking over the horizon. It was a symbol of hope, of a new beginning he could almost see on the horizon. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe it might come. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the trial approached its critical juncture. The weight of weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional confessions hung over everyone involved. Judge Hayes, seated at the bench, knew this case had transcended the boundaries of a typical trial. It was no longer about the crime itself. It had become a battle for truth, a reckoning with years of silence and manipulation. Miguel, the boy whose life had been upended by accusations, sat quietly beside Dr. Evelyn Rose, his silence now carrying the strength of 1,000 words. The prosecution had saved its most damning evidence for this moment. As the courtroom settled, a forensic expert was called to the stand to present their findings. They unveiled a detailed analysis of the crime scene, focusing on the small but vital details that had been ignored in the initial investigation. The blood-stained blanket, tucked behind the dresser, was re-examined under advanced techniques, revealing fibers that matched a coat belonging to Roberto. Even more shocking, traces of infant formula were found on Roberto's clothing from that night, placing him dangerously close to the nursery during the crime. As the expert laid out the findings, Roberto sat rigid in his seat, his once defiant posture now reduced to a thin veneer of control. The court had begun to see through him. Each revelation chipped away at the image he had spent years cultivating. But the most powerful blow came when the prosecution played the voicemail Roberto had left on Grace's phone. His angry threats, combined with the sound of a baby crying in the background, were a haunting reminder of the crime's brutal reality. Gasps echoed through the room, and for the first time, even Roberto's own defense team seemed unsure of how to proceed. For Miguel, the trial had been a test of endurance. Confined to his silence, he had watched as others spoke for him, as evidence he couldn't articulate was brought to light. But something had shifted in him. With each passing day, as the case unraveled and the truth emerged, the weight he carried seemed to lessen. It was during a late-night session with Dr. Rose that he finally made his breakthrough. Sitting across from her, pencil in hand, Miguel hesitated before writing a single sentence on a blank sheet of paper. He slid it across the table, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I didn't do it." The words, simple yet profound, marked the first time Miguel had actively defended himself. Rose, though composed, felt a swell of emotion. This was a moment she had been waiting for, not just as his advocate, but as someone who believed in his innocence. She knew this small act of defiance against the narrative forced upon him was the beginning of his healing. She carefully folded the paper, knowing it would become a key piece of his eventual testimony. In court, the defense scrambled to cast doubt on the mounting evidence. They leaned heavily on the argument that Miguel's silence was suspicious, a tactic that had initially swayed public opinion. But now, with every piece of forensic evidence and every testimony pointing toward Roberto, the argument fell flat. The prosecution seized the opportunity to dismantle the defense's claims, highlighting Miguel's drawings as a vivid and credible account of what he had witnessed. The boy's silence, they argued, was not guilt but survival, a shield against the danger that had loomed over him for far too long. Mateo, Miguel's uncle, also took the stand, offering a heartfelt testimony that painted a stark contrast to Roberto's cold, calculated demeanor. He spoke of Miguel's gentle nature, his resilience despite losing his parents, and the fear he had seen in the boy's eyes long before the crime. "Miguel is not a murderer," Mateo declared, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "He's a child who's been through more pain than most of us can imagine, and he deserves justice." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hayes called for a short recess. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Reporters rushed to file updates. Spectators whispered furiously, and William Hartman sat in stony silence, his once commanding presence now reduced to a shadow of itself. Grace, seated a few rows behind him, stared at her hands, the guilt of her silence etched into her face. She had finally spoken out, but the cost of her years of complicity weighed heavily on her. When the court reconvened, Judge Hayes addressed the room with a solemn expression. "This case has revealed not just the details of a crime, but the complex and painful truths hidden within a family," he began, his voice measured. "It is our duty to ensure that justice is not only served but understood." With that, Hayes turned his attention to Miguel. The boy, who had endured weeks of scrutiny and accusation, stood at the center of everyone's attention. But this time, he wasn't alone. Rose placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder as Mateo nodded from the gallery. For the first time, Miguel's voice was heard, not through his drawings, not through his silence, but through a soft, trembling statement. "I didn't hurt her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw him. Roberto. The room erupted in murmurs, but Hayes quickly restored order. Miguel's statement, though brief, carried the weight of weeks of evidence and testimony. It was the final blow to Roberto's crumbling defense. The man who had once wielded power with impunity now sat hunched in his seat, his mask of control shattered. The chapter concluded with Roberto being taken into custody. As he was led out of the courtroom, his expression was a mixture of anger and fear. For Miguel, it was a moment of quiet vindication. The truth he had carried alone for so long was finally out in the open. Sitting beside Dr. Roas, he allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. The nightmare wasn't over, but for the first time, he could see the light breaking through the darkness. The courtroom had become a battlefield of words, evidence, and emotions. Roberto, now officially charged and awaiting his final trial, had transformed from a figure of intimidation to one of disgrace. His arrest marked a turning point, but the fight for justice was far from over. For Miguel, the boy who had endured so much, the moment of vindication had brought only partial relief. His name had been cleared in the public eye, but the scars of the ordeal lingered like shadows in his mind. Judge Hayes, Dr. Evelyn Rose, and Miguel's Uncle Mateo knew there was still work to be done, not just to ensure Roberto faced justice, but to help Miguel begin to heal. As preparations for Roberto's trial intensified, the investigation uncovered more disturbing truths. Financial records revealed a pattern of embezzlement within the Hartman family business, with Roberto siphoning money through shell companies for years. While this corruption didn't directly link him to the crime, it painted a picture of a man willing to exploit any opportunity for personal gain. Testimonies from former employees further solidified his reputation as a manipulator who used fear and coercion to maintain control. Each new revelation tightened the legal noose around Roberto's neck. Meanwhile, Miguel's drawings took on new dimensions. No longer confined to dark depictions of fear and trauma, they began to reflect his growing sense of agency. One drawing, shared with Dr. Rose, depicted a small figure walking away from a crumbling castle, its walls cracked and falling. Rose saw it as a symbol of Miguel leaving the oppressive weight of the Hartman family's influence behind. "You're stronger than you know," she told him during one of their sessions. Her words met with a hesitant but genuine smile. At the Hartman estate, tensions reached a breaking point. William Hartman, once a commanding and revered figure, found himself at the center of scrutiny. His unwavering support for Roberto had alienated many of his allies, and whispers of his complicity in covering up the crime began to circulate. Grace, emboldened by her testimony and the growing support from the public, confronted her husband in a rare moment of defiance. "You chose him over the truth," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Now, you'll have to face the consequences." William's reaction was a mixture of anger and resignation. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the enormity of his actions or inactions. His decision to protect Roberto at all costs had not only endangered his family, but tarnished the legacy he had worked so hard to build. But William's reckoning was still unfolding, and his role in the larger narrative remained murky. Grace, for her part, resolved to take an active role in rebuilding what had been lost, starting with her fractured relationship with Miguel. In court, the trial against Roberto unfolded with relentless intensity. The prosecution presented a meticulously constructed case, weaving together physical evidence, financial records, and testimonies to paint a damning portrait of Roberto's actions. Key witnesses took the stand, including Grace, who spoke with raw honesty about the night of the crime. Her account of Roberto's threats and his erratic behavior brought the jury face to face with the man behind the mask. Mateo, too, offered powerful testimony, describing the lengths to which Roberto had gone to manipulate and silence Miguel. But the most powerful moment came when Miguel himself was called to testify. The courtroom held its collective breath as the boy took the stand, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing structure. Judge Hayes had prepared him carefully, ensuring he felt supported every step of the way. Dr. Rose and Mateo sat nearby, their presence a quiet reassurance. Miguel's voice, though soft, carried a strength that silenced the room. He described what he had seen that night, how he had entered the nursery to check on the baby, only to find Roberto standing over the crib. "He told me not to say anything," Miguel said, his hands trembling as he clutched the edges of the witness stand. "He said bad things would happen if I did." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Hayes quickly restored order. Miguel's testimony was a turning point, solidifying the prosecution's case and leaving the defense scrambling. For Roberto, it was the moment when his carefully constructed lies crumbled completely. He sat motionless, his expression a mix of anger and fear, as the boy he had tried to silence for so long found his voice in the most public of ways. Outside the courtroom, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Once vilified, Miguel had become a symbol of resilience and courage. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice for Miguel" and "Truth Prevails." The media, too, had shifted its focus, turning its lens on Roberto's crimes and the systemic failures that had allowed them to go unchecked for so long. For the first time, the narrative was no longer controlled by the Hartman family. It was being rewritten by those seeking justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense made a last-ditch effort to discredit Miguel's testimony, suggesting his silence and trauma made his recollections unreliable. But the prosecution countered with the overwhelming evidence that had been gathered, including Miguel's drawings and the voicemail Roberto had left on Grace's phone. "This is not the imagination of a child," the prosecutor argued. "This is the truth, told in the only way Miguel could." The chapter ended with a powerful moment of unity. Miguel, leaving the courtroom after his testimony, was greeted by Mateo and Dr. Rose. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to relax, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of the world. The sunlight outside the courthouse was warm on his face, a reminder that the darkest storms eventually pass. The fight wasn't over, but for Miguel, this was a victory, a step toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with every seat filled and a sea of reporters gathered outside. Their cameras trained on the doors as the trial of Roberto Hartman reached its conclusion. The tension in the room was palpable, every person present knowing they were witnessing the final chapter of a case that had captivated the entire city. Roberto, the man whose manipulations had cast a shadow over so many lives, sat at the defense table with his head bowed. Across the room, Miguel sat beside Mateo and Dr. Evelyn Rose, his quiet strength a stark contrast to the storm that surrounded him. The prosecution delivered its closing argument with unwavering conviction. They recounted the damning evidence that had come to light. The bloodstained blanket hidden at the crime scene, the fibers matching Roberto's coat, and the haunting voicemail where his rage and desperation were captured for all to hear. Each piece of evidence painted a vivid picture of a man who had not only committed a heinous crime, but had gone to great lengths to frame an innocent child for his actions. The prosecutor's final words left the room in a heavy silence. This trial isn't just about holding Roberto Hartman accountable. It's about restoring justice for a boy who was robbed of his innocence and a life that was stolen too soon. Roberto's defense team tried desperately to counter the prosecution's claims, but their arguments rang hollow. They focused on Miguel's silence, attempting to cast doubt on his testimony. But the evidence against Roberto was overwhelming. The defense's narrative unraveled further when Grace Hartman took the stand one last time. Her voice was steady as she recounted the years of manipulation and fear Roberto had sown within the family. "I stayed silent for too long," she admitted, her gaze shifting to Miguel. "But no more. The truth deserves to be heard, no matter the cost." Judge Hayes, observing the proceedings with his usual calm but resolute demeanor, addressed the jury as the final testimonies concluded. "This case has revealed the very best and worst of human nature," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the trial's gravity. "You have heard the evidence, seen the pain it has caused, and now it is your responsibility to ensure that justice is served, not just for the victim, but for all those who have been impacted. As the jury deliberated, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Outside, the crowd of supporters had grown, their chants of justice for Miguel echoing through the halls. For Miguel, the hours of waiting were excruciating. Seated in a quiet room with Mateo and Dr. Roas, he fidgeted with a pencil, sketching absent-mindedly on a blank sheet of paper. His drawings had been a lifeline throughout the ordeal, a way to communicate when words failed him. This time, however, the image he created was simple. A small figure standing beneath a bright sun, the darkness behind him fading into the distance. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent as everyone awaited the verdict. Roberto sat stiffly, his expression unreadable, while Miguel gripped Mateo's hand tightly. The foreperson stood and, with a steady voice, delivered the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant Roberto Hartman guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in emotion. Gasps, cries, and murmurs filled the space as Roberto's face fell, his composure finally breaking. He was immediately taken into custody, his reign of manipulation and fear brought to an end. For Miguel, the moment was surreal. The boy who had been vilified, accused, and silenced for so long was finally free from the shadow of guilt that had loomed over him. Tears streamed down his face as Mateo wrapped him in a protective embrace. Dr. Roas, standing beside them, smiled softly, knowing this was a victory not just for justice, but for Miguel's healing. The aftermath of the trial brought a sense of closure for many, but it also left lingering questions about the Hartman family's future. William Hartman, once a towering figure of influence, had retreated from the public eye, his empire in disarray. Grace, now estranged from her husband, dedicated herself to rebuilding what had been lost, starting with an effort to support victims of abuse and manipulation. Her relationship with Miguel, though still fragile, showed signs of hope. She visited him regularly, offering small gestures of kindness as they worked to rebuild trust. For Miguel, the road to recovery was only beginning. Though he had been exonerated, the trauma of the ordeal remained. Dr. Roas continued to work closely with him, helping him navigate his emotions and reclaim his sense of self. Mateo, ever a source of stability, made arrangements for Miguel to leave the detention facility and live with him. "You're not alone anymore," he told Miguel as they packed up his belongings. "We'll face whatever comes next together." The chapter ended with a powerful image. Miguel standing outside the courthouse, the sunlight warming his face. In his hands, he held the sketch of the small figure beneath the sun. It was a symbol of his journey, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. As the crowd cheered and reporters shouted questions, Miguel remained quiet, his silence no longer a shield but a statement. He didn't need words to tell his story. The truth had already been spoken. The city slowly moved on from the trial, but for those closest to the case, its impact would linger for a lifetime. Roberto's conviction had brought justice, but justice was only part of the healing process. For Miguel, life outside the walls of the detention center was both a relief and a challenge. The freedom he had longed for was finally his, but the scars of his ordeal, both seen and unseen, reminded him daily of how much had been taken. Miguel's transition to living with Mateo was a mix of hope and hesitation. The small apartment was modest but warm, filled with personal touches that spoke of Mateo's quiet, caring nature. He had transformed one of the spare rooms into a sanctuary for Miguel, complete with art supplies and a bookshelf filled with stories of resilience and hope. At first, Miguel spent most of his time in silence, retreating to the familiar comfort of drawing. But slowly, under Mateo's patient encouragement, he began to open up. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, Miguel pushed a sketch across to Mateo. It showed two figures standing side by side, one larger, protective and steady, the other smaller but no longer shrouded in shadow. Mateo studied the drawing for a long moment before meeting Miguel's eyes. "We're in this together," he said softly, his words resonating in the quiet room. It was a simple exchange, but it marked the beginning of Miguel's willingness to trust again. Meanwhile, the Hartman family faced its own reckoning. William Hartman, once untouchable, had resigned from his company amid public outcry. His wealth and influence, once his greatest assets, had become liabilities as the truth of his family's dysfunction was laid bare. Grace, on the other hand, emerged as an unexpected advocate for change. She began using her platform to raise awareness about abuse and the importance of listening to children's voices. Though her journey of redemption was far from complete, she made it clear that she was committed to breaking the cycle of silence that had defined her family for so long. For Miguel, Grace's outreach was met with cautious acceptance. She visited regularly, bringing small gifts and asking about his interests. At first, Miguel's responses were clipped, his walls still firmly in place. But over time, he began to share fragments of his world, his favorite stories, his drawings, and even his hopes for the future. It was a slow, delicate process, but it represented a bridge being built between two people forever linked by tragedy. Dr. Evelyn Rose continued to play a pivotal role in Miguel's recovery. Their sessions shifted from crisis management to rebuilding, focusing on helping him navigate his emotions and find his voice in the world. One day, during a particularly reflective session, Miguel shared a memory that had haunted him since the night of the crime. "I wanted to protect her," he whispered, his voice trembling, "but I was too scared." Rose reassured him that his fear didn't diminish his bravery, that surviving and speaking out was an act of courage in itself. Miguel's drawings also evolved, becoming brighter and more intricate. One day, he created a piece that showed a tree growing strong and tall, its roots deep and unshakable despite the rocky soil. When Rose asked him about it, Miguel explained, "It's about me, about starting again." His words were tentative, but they carried a conviction that hadn't been there before. It was a testament to his resilience, a symbol of his determination to move forward. The chapter reached its emotional peak during a community event organized by Grace. The event, focused on child advocacy and healing, was attended by hundreds, including families who had followed Miguel's case closely. At Grace's invitation, Miguel agreed to display some of his drawings. Standing beside Mateo and Rose, he watched as attendees admired his work, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding. For the first time, Miguel saw how his story could inspire others. One particular drawing, a simple sketch of a boy standing beneath a bright sun, caught the attention of a young girl. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the piece. "He's not scared anymore," she said, her voice filled with the kind of innocent insight only children possess. Miguel overheard her words and felt a swell of emotion. She was right. He wasn't scared anymore, not in the way he had been before. The fear that had once silenced him had been replaced by a quiet strength, one that no one could take away. As the event wound down, Grace approached Miguel with a tentative smile. "You've grown so much," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Miguel looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. It was a small exchange, but it carried the weight of a shared journey toward healing. The final scenes of the chapter painted a picture of hope and renewal. Miguel, now more confident, began attending a local school where his love of art flourished. Mateo, ever the steady presence, encouraged him to pursue his dreams without fear. Together, they worked to create a life free from the shadows of the past. Dr. Rose remained a trusted mentor, offering guidance as Miguel navigated the challenges of adolescence. The chapter closed with Miguel sitting beneath a tree in a local park, sketchpad in hand. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the page as he worked on a new drawing. This one showed a boy standing on a hill, looking out over a vast, open landscape. The horizon was bright and clear, a symbol of the future that now stretched before him. For Miguel, it wasn't just a drawing, it was a promise to himself. No matter what came next, he would face it with courage and hope. Enjoy the story, Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care